Hi guys, and welcome to the Is It Worth It for the IS-6, the Tier 8 Soviet Premium Heavy Tank. This tank is currently available from the gift shop or from the tech tree for 11,800 gold. And the question we're going to be asking today is this tank worth 11,800 gold? The history of the IS-6 began in 1943 after the battle for Kursk. A lot of German armour, including Tigers and Ferdinands, were captured by the Soviet forces, and Soviet engineers were impressed by a lot of the German technology they were seeing. They liked the gun systems on German tanks. They were also impressed by the steering systems. The steering systems seemed to make the German tanks a lot easier to use and steer. They were also impressed by the transmission systems, the mechanical transmission on the Tiger and the electrical transmission on the Ferdinand. So they decided to see whether or not they could incorporate any of that German technology into a new line of Russian heavy tanks, and in early 1944 two prototypes were developed side by side. They were the Object 252 and the Object 253. Now, even though they were two separate prototypes, they were developed side by side and they both ended up getting the name IS-6. So there were two IS-6 prototypes developed, but they were different tanks. There were major differences between the two tanks. There were some similarities, however. Both IS-6s used the same hull and the same turret. They also used the same gun, which was the 122mm D30. Now, this was pretty much the same gun as the D25 being used on a lot of Russian tanks at the time, but it did have a couple of minor differences. One, it came with a gun rammer to enable faster reload, but it also came with an automated gas venting system, which meant that after firing, the gun barrel could be purged of fumes much quicker. But they were basically the similarities. There were also quite a few differences as well. The first difference between the two IS-6 prototypes was the tracks. You can see that the tracks here don't have any track wheels, they only have road wheels. Now, the suspension used on this version of the IS-6, the Object 252, was the same suspension. It was the IS-3 prototype suspension. So this is the suspension used on the IS-3 prototype. The IS-3 suspension was upgraded over time, so you can see that it had road wheels and it had track wheels. Now, this later variant of suspension was used on the other IS-6. So the first IS-6 used the IS-3's prototype suspension. The Object 253 used the later suspension from the IS, but that was the first major difference. The other major difference between the two IS-6s was the Object 252, this tank in-game, came with a mechanical transmission, just like most of the IS line of tanks, whereas the Object 253, the other IS-6, came with the electrical transmission from a Ferdinand. In late 1944, both IS-6 prototypes were finished and went into testing. However, at exactly the same time as the IS-6s were put into prototype stage and went into testing, a third Soviet heavy tank, the Object 701, had also been designed and went into testing alongside them. So all three prototypes were tested side by side, and although all three tanks completed the trial successfully, the Object 701, which later became known as the IS-4, was the tank chosen for further development. The Object 253 was rejected at prototype stage because the electrical transmission from the Ferdinand was too complicated for easy field repair, and it also was heavier than mechanical transmission, which meant that the tank's mobility was reduced. And then the Object 252 was rejected, which is the tank we have in game, even though it performed well in the trials, simply because the armor profile of the IS-4 was much better than the armor profile of the IS-6. So as a result, the two variants of IS-6 never made it out of prototype stage. The Russian High Command decided to go with the IS-4 instead. So we're going to be comparing the IS-6 against all its Tier 8 premium heavy tank rivals, and that means it's up against the 112 and the 111 for the Chinese. Very similar tanks in stats and gameplay. It's up against the KV-5, which is the tank it replaced. Patch 7.3 saw the removal of the KV-5 and the introduction of the IS-6 to replace it, so it's up against its replacement. We've got the FCM50T for the French, which also gets special matchmaking like the IS-6 and these previous tanks do, and then at the end we've got the Leva and the T-34 for the Germans and Americans respectively. And we're just going to check to see how the IS-6 adds up on paper. Starting off with the hit points, the IS-6 gets 1550 hit points, so that's pretty average for a Tier 8 Premium Heavy Tank. It's more hit points by 50 than the 112, than the FCM50T or the T34, so it's actually better than some of the tanks up here. Similar hit points to the WZ-111, but it gets far fewer hit points than the KV-5 or the Löwe. But hit points wise, nothing special here. Looks pretty average, not good, not bad, just average. When it comes to weight, again, it's pretty average. It actually comes in at about 51 tons or 52.1 tons for me, which makes it very, very similar to maybe the FCM50T. What did surprise me is that it's actually significantly heavier than the 112 or the 111. So it's not a heavy tank, but it's not light. There are lighter tanks up here. So again, when it comes to weight, it's pretty average. And when it comes to engine power, it's also pretty average. Nothing special here. It comes with a 700 horsepower engine. So that's significantly worse than the KV-5, the FCM50T, the Löwe, or the T34. Significantly better than the 112 or the 111. Although these tanks, they're lighter, have less powerful engines, and have better ground resistance. So I think the performance overall between the IS-6, 112, and WZ-111, it's quite similar. There are some differences, but it's quite similar. So 700 horsepower engine, again, not great, not bad. It does the job, and this isn't the heaviest of tanks, so it means that the horsepower to weight ratio is actually quite good. When it comes to speed, we come to the first major negative, at least on paper. It comes in at 35 kilometers an hour, and that means it's the slowest of the heavy tanks up here. In fact, it equals the Löwe and the T34 with regards to top speed of 35 kilometers an hour, and anyone who's played the Löwe or the T34 knows that these aren't fast tanks, and the IS-6 has exactly the same top speed. However, it's not as heavy as these two tanks, and even though the engine is not as good as the T34 or the Löwe, it does have a better horsepower to weight ratio. So the IS-6 can actually accelerate better than the Löwe or the T34, and it can reach 35 kilometers an hour, but it's definitely one of the slowest heavy tanks up here. The other tanks, the two Chinese tanks, even the KV-5 and the FCM50T have it significantly beaten. So 35 kilometers an hour on paper, not looking so good. 26 degrees per second traverse speed, very, very average, nothing special here. It's similar to the Chinese tanks. It's actually got better traverse speed than the Löwe or the T34, significantly better traverse speed than the KV-5, but significantly worse traverse speed than the FCM50T. So 26 degrees per second, not good, not bad, again, right in the middle. The turret traverse speed is also very, very average at 24 degrees per second. Again, not the worst. It's got better turret traverse speed slightly than the KV-5, the Löwe, or the T34. It's also got worse turret traverse speed slightly over the 112, the 111, and then the FCM50T has it significantly beaten. So turret traverse, again, nothing special here. It's pretty average right in the middle. Coming to view range, it's a negative for the tank. It comes in at 350 meters of view range. Now that's the worst view range of any of the tanks up here. In fact, only the KV-5 has similar view range. So 350 meters of view range at Tier 8 up against Tier 8s and Tier 9s means that this tank is as blind as a bat. Can't spot its own targets. It needs to be on the front line. It needs to be brawling just down to that really, really poor view range. View range is definitely a negative for the IS-6, and then another negative for the IS-6 is the signal range, which comes in at 440 meters. Again, the worst signal range of any of the tanks up here, with the exception of the KV-5s. When it comes to armor, it looks like another negative on paper because it only has 100 millimeters of frontal hull armor. That means it's the worst armored tank up here, at least on paper. Even the T34 gets 102 millimeters of frontal hull armor compared to 100 on the IS-6, so on paper, not looking so good. However, the side armor does look a little bit better at 100 millimeters as well, so it gets 100 millimeters of side armor. That's better than the Chinese tanks. It's also better than the FCM50T or the T34. It's similar side armor to the Löwe, and only the KV-5 has it beaten. So bad frontal hull armor on paper, very good side armor on paper, and then the rear armor is pretty standard. Not great, not bad. And the turret armor, the trend continues, because on paper the turret armor doesn't look very good either. It does get 150mm of frontal turret armor. Now that's worse than the Chinese tanks. It's even worse than the KV-5. However, on paper it's better than the FCM-50T or the Löwe, and then very few tanks are better than the frontal turret armor on the T-34. So a lot of tanks have more frontal turret armor than the IS-6, but it's not the worst. And then the side of the turret is 150mm, which again, like the side hull armor, is a bonus. It's actually got the best side turret armor, equaling the KV-5, but it has all the other tanks beaten. And then the rear of the turret is 100mm thick, and again, that's actually quite good. That's better than most of the other turrets up here, with the exception of the T-34, which gets 203 rear turret armor. So yeah, the armor does not look fantastic. It seems to have very, very good side armor, decent rear armor, but the frontal armor on paper looks absolutely terrible compared to the other tanks. But as we know, the stats in the garage never tell the whole story, so we're going to pop into Tanks GG to have a closer look at this armor. And even though the hull armor is very, very poor, it's got the worst hull armor of any of the Tier 8 premium heavy tanks, what you can see is due to the amazing sloping and angling of the IS-6, it's actually a lot more effective than the 100mm that is reported. As you can see, the lower glacis is actually about 200mm of effective armor. The lower glacis is actually better than the upper glacis. The upper glacis itself is actually about 180mm of effective armor. It differs slightly in places, but it's roughly about 200 lower glacis, 180 upper glacis, and that means that lower tier tanks are going to have some problems penning you from the front. Now there is a weak spot, a much publicized weak spot, which is the driver's hatch. Now the driver's hatch is only about 150-160mm of effective armor. It does mean that some lower tier tanks are going to be able to pen the driver's hatch more easily than they are going to pen the upper glacis, the lower glacis, but on the other hand, there are lots of lower tier tanks that still might have problems penning the driver's hatch. So it's a weak spot, but not that much weaker than the rest of the hull. But as I say, you can go for it. Now, the reason that the hull armor is incredibly troll, apart from the sloping, is because of some of the angling. You can see that this tank actually has cheeks, and these cheeks, from distance or from when the tank is directly facing you, if you don't hit the front of the tank, you're going to be hitting the cheeks, and that means that you've got 250mm of effective armor on the cheeks, just down to some amazing sloping, some really, really good angling. So the cheeks from the front, very, very good, and they're also very, very good from distance, and very, very good against lower tier tanks. So the armor can be very, very troll, even against some upper tier or higher tier tanks, if they're not hitting the correct places. However, you need to keep this tank pointed directly towards the enemy, because it's not a pike nose, it's flat armor, even though there is some angling, because as soon as you start to angle, what you're doing is you're flattening up these cheeks. Now the frontal armor doesn't get that much better, so even though you're angling, you're at about 190 directly front, but if you angle just slightly, what you can see is we're still at about 190. It doesn't actually improve the armor of the tank that much by angling, so you're still going to maybe improve some areas, but it's still roughly going to be about the same penetration values. But the cheeks are no longer effective, so as soon as, I know it's very, very hard, it's hard for me, even as an experienced player, to remember not to angle this tank, because the tank is most effective when it's pointing directly towards an enemy tank. As soon as you start to angle, you start to flatten up these cheeks, and you go from about 260mm of effective armor down to about 180, and it gets worse. I mean, if you're fighting a tank that's maybe taller than you, they're going to be shooting down on this plate, and it only drops to about 154mm. So the cheeks can be very, very effective frontally, but they can also be very, very poor if you angle the armor. So the cheeks can be both a strength and a weakness from the front of this tank, depending on how it's angled. And the turret is exactly the same. If you know what you're doing, the turret can be penetrated quite easily by a lot of tanks, but against inexperienced players or against lower tier tanks, the turret armor can be quite effective. So it's got 150mm of effective turret armor on the front. in the garage. But what you can see here is this side of the turret is very, very well sloped, very, very well angled. So even though it's only 150 millimeters of armor, it's actually up to about 260 millimeters of effective armor, increasing the further out you hit. So the left-hand side of the turret armor is very, very good. The gun mantlet is very, very troll. You could see that it's very, very good in some places. It's got a typically good gun mantlet for a Russian tank. 641 millimeters of effective armor in some places, but again, there are weak spots. You can see that the effective armor drops down to 163 here, 170 here. So there are some weak spots in the gun mantlet that higher tier tanks are going to have no problems penning, but there's always a chance your spaced armor is going to absorb those shots. So gun mantlet can be very, very good, but it's not perfect. Now, there is a weak spot some people don't know about, because you can see the way the gun mantlet is here. The gun mantlet extends over to the left-hand side of the turret, meaning it's very, very effective if you're fighting around a right-hand corner. You're only going to be exposing the left-hand side of your turret, so the armor is very, very effective. But on this side of the turret, the gun mantlet doesn't extend out quite so much, and that means you're exposing more of your turret. And what you can see is you've actually got a flat area just to the right of the gun mantlet that the gun mantlet doesn't cover, and that area can be penned by quite a few tanks. So 185 here, 165 here. It drops to 150 millimeters right beside the gun mantlet. So the right-hand side of the front turret on an IS-6 can be penned by quite a lot of higher tier tanks, and even lower tier tanks with some decent penetrating guns can penetrate a flat area to the right of the gun mantlet. It is quite hard to hit, and quite often if you're moving your tank or you're moving your turret, you can force them to fire a little bit wider, and if they hit wider, then you can see that the effective armor once again starts to angle, starts to get much, much better. But there is a weak spot here a lot of players need to be aware of, and if you're angling or if you're coming around left-hand corners, you're going to be exposing the right-hand side of your turret first, and you can be penned right here. So weak spot you need to be aware of. The cupolas are actually, they look like weak spots, but they're not that weak. They are easy to hit. There are two very, very large cupolas on the tank. Now, they are weaker than most of the other frontal armor on the tank, but they're still 155 millimeters, so there is a chance of bouncing as well because they're slightly angled, but lower tier tanks are going to find it difficult to pen the cupolas on an IS-6. However, there is a very, very weak roof. The IS-6 is a very, very weak roof that can be penetrated from the front because it is angled downwards. It's only 56 millimeters of effective armor. In fact, the roof armor is only 30 millimeters on this tank, so you can actually pen the roof of an IS-6 if you're in a lower tier tank. Oh, hello, Heavy Tank 6. You have no chance of penning me at all. Oh. So when I was playing this game, I thought that the Heavy Tank 6 was going to have major problems penning me, but no. The roof of the IS-6 is very, very weak. As you can see here, I thought he actually hit me on the roof, but he didn't. He actually managed to hit my cupola. And even though the Heavy Tank 6 is very, very poor penetration with its AP, it was still able to pen and do damage to the front of the IS-6. So the roof, if tanks are shooting down at you, even lower tier tanks, the roof is going to be a weak spot. So as you can see, the frontal armor is much, much better than the garage stats would have you believe. Some amazing angling, some amazing sloping means that the armor can be very, very effective. It's very, very effective against lower tier tanks. It's also very, very effective against players who are inexperienced. However, there are enough weak spots on the front of an IS-6 for an experienced player to exploit. As I say, there's the driver's hatch, there's an area to the right of the gun mantlet, and the roof is incredibly weak, so you can shoot the roof. You can overmatch the roof armor from the front if you've got an accurate gun. But the troll armor continues because the side armor is very, very good. Now you can side scrape in this tank if you're facing an inexperienced player. But the problem with side scraping, you've got 100 millimeters of side armor. You can see the effective armor is very, very good. But the problem, as I say, with side scraping is these cheeks. As soon as you angle your tank, you're going to be exposing the cheeks of your tank, and that means that enemy players who know what they're doing aren't even going to try. They might bounce 1 or 2 shots here by accident, but then they're going to be shooting your cheeks because you reduce the effective armor of your cheeks significantly when you decide to angle. So here I am on Ensk, and I'm going to be trying some side scraping. So I'm moving into a side scraping position. The side armor on the IS-6 is fantastic, just waiting for victims, and here's an IS-3. Now my gun is going to have problems penning the front of an IS-3 unless I switch to premium. Take a snapshot, and I'm adjusting my angle. So pull back, and there we go. So side armor, very, very troll. Tracks eat the shots. Tracks are spaced armor on this tank. I'll come to that in a moment. But unfortunately missed that shot. Wait for my tracks to come back up. So going to side scrape. And what you're going to see is how effective the armor is when you side scrape at a proper angle. And there we go. So IS-3, more than enough penetration, but because we're side scraping, he manages to bounce. However, now that I want to shoot back, sneak a shot into a T-34-3, I'm side scraping. I think I'm at a good angle. IS-3 should have reloaded by now. And he's just penned me. Okay, so look at that. I thought I was angled, but he was able to put a shot straight through my cheek. Now, an IS-3 has no problems penning the front of this tank regardless of what angle it's at, but because I'm side scraping, this guy bounced once on the rear of my tank. Now he's going for the cheek. And as I say, side scraping in this tank is very, very good if, as I say, if the player who's facing you is inexperienced or in a lower tier tank. But try to sneak one in, get back into cover, and again, he doesn't hit my cheek. He goes for my cheek, doesn't get my cheek. As you can see, we bounce, so I'm going to reload in time. This guy knows what he's doing. He's side scraping. I'm going for his turret roof. We sneak one into his turret roof, so IS-3 can be penned, well, through the turret roof, but once again, wasn't quick enough to get back into cover, and a shot into my cheek. So yeah, it's only good. Angling and side scraping is great in this tank, but only against inexperienced players, because you're going to have to expose this cheek, and anyone with a decent penetrating gun is going to be able to penetrate it. However, it's still worth trying to side scrape, because not only do you have very, very effective 100mm of side armor that goes up to about 330mm side scraping, you've also got spaced armor. You've got a strip of spaced armor right here. This is 30mm of spaced armor. That increases the effective armor as well. As you can see, we're up to 290 here with a bounce. We're up to 357. This can absorb its spaced armor. It can absorb shots. And then the tracks also count as spaced armor. The tracks count as 20mm of spaced armor. So once again, these can absorb shots. They can prevent damage to your tank. So it is worth trying to side scrape in an IS-6, as I say, if you're up against lower tier tanks or inexperienced players. But this cheek definitely means side scraping is not that effective against experienced players. Another reason the armor on the IS-6 can be considered troll, especially at distance, is this band of spaced armor. You can see that the effective armor here is about 500mm. Now, this band of spaced armor extends from the side of the tank. It's angled around the front of the tank and then back down the other side. So from distance, this band protects your turret ring, and it is extremely effective. So even higher tier tanks can get unexpected bounces on an IS-6, especially from distance if they hit this spaced armor. So decent frontal armor, troll side armor, unless you expose the side of your tank, and this is where problems start occurring, because an IS-6 is very, very vulnerable once tanks get to the side and rear. The side armor, even though it looks okay here, it's only about 150mm, 160mm of effective side turret armor, and it's quite flat, so players are going to be able to penetrate this even with some lower tier guns. The side of the tank, even though it's incredibly well angled, look at the sloping and angling here, when you get directly to the side, it's only about 120mm of effective armor. Higher tier guns can also go through the spaced armor on the side of an IS-3, so it's only about 130mm of effective armor. So the side armor, not very good on this tank. The rear armor, again, it can be quite troll. You can bounce lower tier tanks with your rear armor because it is sloped, it is angled, but again, it's only about 60mm, about 80mm of effective armor. The rear of the turret's about 100mm of effective armor, so most tanks get to your side and rear are going to be able to penetrate an IS-6 without too much trouble. The only time it's really going to be troll from the side or from the rear is when you're in a lower tier tank. Now, something you need to note, and one of the reasons I usually spend a day in a tank before doing the review is, you know, when you play 2 or 3 games in a tank, you play it and you go, okay, those weren't too bad, and then you move on to another tank. But when you spend a day in a tank, you suddenly realize that maybe there are some strengths or weaknesses that, you know, you don't experience consistently if you don't play, you know, if you play the tank only once or twice a day. I played over 30 games in the IS-6 for this review, and I discovered that this tank, even though the armor is incredibly troll, something that occurred to me is arty can absolutely decimate IS-6s. They really, really can. You've only got 30 millimeters of effective armor on the top of your turret. You've only got 20 millimeters of effective armor on the rear of your tank. And that means that arty can penetrate with full HE if they hit the top of your tank. Even if they hit the rear of your tank, they're only going to be going through about 63, 69 millimeters of armor. And that means that arty can have enough penetration to hit the rear of an IS-6, penetrate and do full damage. And I'd say that the majority of my deaths during the 30 games I was playing for this review were from arty. I think I got killed 7 or 8 times by arty during the games for this review. I didn't realize the tank was so susceptible to arty, but you've got to be aware it is. So here we are in Erlenberg. I've sneaked up behind a Tiger 2, going to go for the finishing shot, finish him, and start to move. And one hit killed to the rear of the tank by an M40 M43. 1,550 hit points gone in one shot. And that's just one example of what arty can do to an IS-6. I was constantly surprised at how much damage I was taking from arty. This tank doesn't seem to accept HE damage very, very well. So let's talk about this gun. Now, the IS-6 comes with the D30, which is an upgraded version of the D25, 122mm that's found on a lot of Russian tanks. Now, it's slightly better in some ways, but not by much, and to all intents and purposes, it's the same gun. It's got the same stats as pretty much every other Russian 122mm gun has in the game. So if you're used to driving a tank like the IS with the final gun, you know what to expect on the IS-6. Now, it does get slightly better DPM over the IS. It gets 2085. You can increase that with equipment and crew skills. So for a heavy tank at tier 8, the DPM is quite good. The rate of fire, obviously, is good because it's got good DPM, and the reload time comes in at about 11.22 seconds, and you can reduce that down to about 10 seconds with equipment and crew skills. So it's got good DPM, it's got good rate of fire, good reload, and the damage is typically Russian, 390 alpha damage, so some positives for the gun. Nice DPM, nice alpha damage, but really from there on it's all downhill because you're stuck with 175mm of penetration. Now, that's okay if you're top tier and you're shooting lower tier tanks. 175mm of penetration is okay. Problem is, a lot of tanks have 175mm of penetration, but they've got the speed and maneuverability to get to the side and rear of enemy tanks and use that 175mm. The IS-6 doesn't. It's a heavy tank, it's a brawler. It's going to be taking on heavy tanks frontally, and at least if you're playing it that way. And 175mm of penetration is going to have major problems going through the front of an IS-3. It's going to have major problems going through the front of a KV-4. So it's going to struggle against enemy heavy tanks. And because you're a heavy tank and you're a brawler, you're usually going to be meeting enemy tanks head to head. So 175mm of penetration can be very, very poor, and you do find yourself firing some premium ammo. So penetration is a negative for the gun. The shell velocity is another negative that I really wasn't aware of till I sat down to play games for this review. I found the shell velocity was a lot slower than my memory led me to believe. 790mm or meters a second is not great, and it means that, again, if you're firing at tanks from long distance, it's going to take a while for your shot to hit the target. So you're going to have to lead targets, and yeah, shell velocity is definitely on the slow side. Another negative for the gun is the ammo. You only get 30 rounds in the IS-6. Now, when you consider you're going to be shooting about 6 rounds a minute and you've only got 30 rounds in the tank, it means that occasionally you can find yourself running low on ammunition. And then again, negatives for the gun. The aim time is absolutely awful. On paper, in the garage, it's going to be about 3.4 seconds. Really, really terrible aim time. So it's going to take you forever to aim in. And even when you're fully aimed, there's no guarantee you're going to hit the target because the accuracy is, again, typically Russian 0.44. It means that sometimes you're going to be able to snipe cupolas from 400 or 500 meters away. Other times you're not going to be able to hit the front of a tank that's sitting 30 or 40 meters away. So the accuracy is typically Russian, and it's not good. In fact, the accuracy on the move and the accuracy during tank traverse is actually worse on the IS-6 than it is on the Tier 7 IS. So the accuracy is definitely a negative. It also gets less gun elevation than a lot of Russian tanks do. So the IS gets more gun elevation. It gets 6 degrees of gun depression. So the gun depression is okay. The gun depression is okay. It could be better, but 6 degrees is workable. And anything else about the gun? Oh yes, the shell cost. The shell cost for the gun is quite expensive. It comes in at about over 1,000 credits a shot. So it means that in order to make money with the IS-6, you really need to hit and penetrate your shots. Okay folks, let's check out this gun in action. We are here on Muravanka. It's a tier 8 game. I'm top tier, and a nice matchup with Ram. I'm platooned with Ram and his FCM-50T. Now the IS-6 is a brawler, especially when it's top tier. I'm not going to be hanging back. I want to be on the front lines, at least while I have hit points. You can see that I'm not the quickest tank. Ram is giving me a push here, but I'm still only doing about 37-38 kilometers an hour. So Ram is giving up his speed and mobility in order to push me into position, but I want to be on the front lines because that's where the IS-6 excels, and this game is where the gun behaves. I did have footage. Unfortunately, I'm going to end up having to cut it, I think, from the review because the review is getting too long, but I have better footage where the gun is struggling against higher tier tanks, but this is just a demonstration of what the gun is capable of. And you can see I missed a shot on an STA-2, but you can see the long aim time. Huge aim time, 3.4 seconds. Took me a long time to aim at this Cromwell, and he's back. Don't know what he's doing, but aim. High alpha damage. That was a low roll. 390 alpha damage on this gun, and we just did 345 to the Cromwell, but we did 718 damage to him in 2 shots. Now technically, if we'd rolled average, he'd be dead. Unfortunately, we weren't rolling average, but we do take him out with a 3rd shot. So that's 4 shots fired and 3 hits, and STA-2 decides to run for it. We go for 1 shot in. I want to be on the front lines. I'm aggressive. I'm the top tier heavy. I want to push the enemy tanks. So aiming carefully. Look at the long aim time. We get a shot into the STA-2, but a 110 is able to pen me from the front, and you can see that a 110 has more than enough penetration to go through the upper glacis on this tank. So the 110 has about 210 millimeters of penetration. There he does it again. So I was at a slight angle, but he's still able to go straight through the lower glacis this time. So 200 millimeters of effective armor on the lower glacis, and the 110 is able to pen it. So the armor is it's great against lower tier tanks, not so good against higher tier. We did manage to bounce a shot from an STA-2, but the 110 has put 2 shots into us. So I'm on 900 hit points, and this 110 seems to be focused on me. So not being quite so aggressive right now. A lot of open ground, and that 110 has not been spotted yet, but we move up. Look at this aim time. Aim. And we take out the SU-100M1. So the alpha damage is good, the rate of fire is good, the aim time, terrible. And the penetration's a little bit lacking, so someone spotted the 110, go for a blind shot. You see the reload is quite good. You can't actually see the technical reload, but I believe it's about 6.1 seconds on the tank at the moment. Not quite sure. But because you've got a high rate of fire and high alpha damage, you really do have decent DPM on this tank. Now, I could have been a little bit more aggressive, but as I say, there's a 110, or a 50-100 and a 110 up here. Don't have shots on either of them. Ram is starting to take fire. This IS is asking for help, so I decide, yeah, okay, alright, let's go for it. So maybe I was a little bit too passive there. This is looking like a win. The score is 9-1, but we've done 1900 damage so far. And against similar tier, lower tier tanks, this gun is great as long as you can pen them. And you can see here aiming for the lower glacis and a bounce. So even against similar tier tanks, similar tier heavy tanks, when you go head to head, the penetration is lacking. You need to pick and choose your targets, like this one, our 5100. Take him out, that takes us up to 2k damage, and in any premium tank, that's what I'm aiming for. If I'm in a tier 8 premium tank, I'm aiming for about 2k damage. Everything else above that's a bonus. 2k damage is 60,000 credits. And I'm just waiting. I need to hit weak spots on this 110 to pen him frontally. He constantly seems to be aiming towards me, but he's just fired, and there we go. He's straightened up, and that gave a flat angle on the beak, so we can pen the front of the 110 using the flat angle. So when we know what we're doing, when we aim for weak spots, we can pen enemy tanks. But you can see that even struggling against a 110 when he was facing me frontally, you can imagine what this gun is like against something like an E75 or an ST1 from the front. The penetration is great against similar tier, lower tier tanks, but against higher tier tanks or higher tier heavies, it's really going to struggle. So it might not have been the best of games. We fired 11 and we only hit 9, so the accuracy is a little bit lacking. Missed a blind shot, and I also missed a shot on the move, but on the other hand, when it does hit, we've got nice alpha damage, and in a game that was only just over 4 minutes old or 4 minutes long, we did 2,500 damage. That's high alpha damage, decent DPM, and a good rate of fire. We received 2 hits and we were penned twice. So again, the armor fantastic against lower tier tanks, not so good against similar tier or higher tier. But as I say, I aim to do about 2,000 damage in tier 8 premium tanks, and that means 60,000 credits. Because we did over 2,000 damage, we ended up earning 67,000 credits. So that's pretty much an average game. That's what I aim for in most tier 8 premiums. Aim to get about 60,000 credits. Everything above that's a bonus. So let's talk about crew. And the IS-6 has 4 crew members. It has a commander, a gunner, a driver, and a loader. And that makes it a very average, if even poor, crew trainer for Russian heavy tanks, because there are a lot of Russian heavy tanks. There are 2 lines of Russian heavies, starting off with the KV-1S or the KV-1 at tier 5, moving all the way up to the IS-7 or the IS-4 at tier 10. And the crew layouts of these tanks are very different. So for example, might as well bring up the IS-6 crew here. We've got the 4-man crew member here, and then we've got the KV-1S at tier 5, and you're going to need a radio operator. KV-1 is exactly the same story. So at tier 5, both heavy tanks for the Russians, you have a spare radio operator. So you are going to be able to train up a full crew in the IS-6 with the exception of the radio operator. Radio operator is going to miss out on some XP. And then things get complicated at tier 6 because the KV-85 is a perfect fit, but the T-150, you're going to need your radio operator again. So you've got a spare radio operator, and then you've got exactly the same issue or a similar issue at tier 7. It's a perfect crew trainer for the IS, and then the KV-3. Yeah, there's your radio operator, but you're also going to need a second loader in the KV-3. So for the second line of Russian heavy tanks, it's not looking so good. IS-3, it's a perfect crew trainer, 4-man crew, but the KV-4 at tier 8, yeah, missing a radio operator and missing a loader, so we're going to have to find spare crew members from somewhere. When we get to tier 9, perfect crew trainer for the IS, but the ST1, we're missing a loader, so the radio operator is no longer in employment. He is unemployed, and now you've got to get an extra loader from somewhere. And then when we come to tier 10, it switches around completely again, because the IS-7 is now, it's no longer a perfect crew trainer. So it was a perfect crew trainer on the original line of Russian heavies, KV-85, IS, IS-3, IS-8, perfect crew trainer, and then the IS-7 at tier 10, you need your extra loader. And on the other line of Russian heavies, we needed radio operators, we needed extra loaders, and then we come to the IS-4, at tier 10, and it's complete reversal. So we need an extra loader for the IS-7, but it's a perfect crew trainer for the IS-4. So as far as crew training goes, it really is a average tank. It depends on what line of tanks you're going up in the first place, but you are going to need extra crew members if you're going up both Russian heavy lines. So let's talk about equipment. Now, there are quite a few equipment choices for the IS-6, but because of some of the weaknesses of the tank, I think some are much more viable than others. Starting off with vert stabs. Now, vert stabs or gun laying drive affect the aim time, and the aim time on this tank is incredibly poor at 3.4 second aim time. It's very, very bad. I do know some players recommend putting both on the tank, putting vert stabs and a gun laying drive on the tank. That's how bad the aim time is. However, I've just gone for one of the two, and if you're going to go for one of the two, then go for vert stabs over gun laying drive all the time, because vert stabs, if it's available for the tank, is going to be better than a gun laying drive in almost every single situation. Improved vents is viable, and I have played around with removing a piece of equipment and putting improved vents on the tank. Plus 5% to all crew skills makes the tank roughly about 2.5% better overall. It is a viable piece of equipment. It depends on whether or not you want to sacrifice something else. A wet ammo rack is a complete and utter waste of time on this tank. I don't get ammo rack that much, and yeah, I think that there are better pieces of equipment. Toolbox, again, like most heavy tanks, I recommend a toolbox if you don't have a well-trained crew in here. As you can see, my crew are currently working on a repair skill, so there's no point in putting a toolbox on the tank. But if you've got a 75% crew in here, it's a new tank, you're just starting out, at least put a toolbox on the tank. It's not going to do it any harm until you start working on that repair skill for your crew. A large caliber gun rammer is absolutely viable because plus 10% to DPM is amazing, and I recommend putting a gun rammer on every single tank if there's a gun rammer available for it. A heavy spall liner is potential. It's got potential because I ended up taking a lot more HE damage or damage from arty than I was expecting to in this tank during my play session, but I think there are better pieces of equipment. Filling the tanks with CO2, complete waste of time. Don't remember being set on fire once during my play session for this tank. Enhanced torsion bars are basically improving your suspension, complete waste of time on this tank. Enhanced gun laying drive, viable because of the very, very poor aim time. As I say, you can put vert stabs and enhanced gun laying drive on this tank to help you with that aim time. It's not going to do it any harm, but if you're going to choose one or the other, then vert stab's better than a gun laying drive, but it is 100% viable. Cyclone filter, complete waste of time on this tank. Much better pieces of equipment. Coated optics I went for on the tank simply because my view range is so bad. I get 350 meters of view range, which is absolutely terrible. With coated optics, equipment and crew skills, I get up to 393, so almost 400 meters. That means I can basically spot tanks a little bit sooner. If there was one piece of equipment I would take off and replace, it would probably be coated optics. I could take this off, put vents on, or I could take this off, put a gun laying drive on, but I just like that little bit of extra view range over some other heavy tanks, but it's really up to you. That's probably the only piece of equipment I'm a little bit iffy on, but I've got it mounted on the tank and I'm quite happy with it. Binocs, complete and utter waste of time in this tank. You're not going to be sitting still. It's not a sniper. The gun isn't accurate enough. The shell velocity isn't quick enough. You don't have enough ammo. The penetration is not good enough. It's not a sniper. So you don't have view range. You don't have the gun to snipe. So Binocs, complete waste of time. And a camo net, complete waste of time, because there are much better pieces of equipment. But as per always, equipment choices are just my opinion. In the end, the choice is up to you. Okay folks, time for the overview game, a game where I show you as many strengths and weaknesses of whatever tank I'm reviewing in one replay. We are here on South Coast, once again, top tier. Didn't realize both games today were top tier, but yeah, IS-6 is at its best when it's top tier. It struggles a little bit in tier 9 games, but once again, because I'm top tier heavy, I'm going to be very aggressive, and you could see that we are accelerating up to 35 kilometers an hour. Now, 35 kilometers an hour, as pointed out, is the slowest of the tier 8 premium tanks. A lot of tanks, tier 8 premium tanks, have faster speeds, but the difference is the IS-6 can accelerate up to 38 or 35 kilometers an hour quickly. It has decent horsepower to weight ratio. And a Type 62 is spamming gold, but he's shooting down at me, so my angled armor is not effective. It's flattened up against a Type 62 shooting down at me, so he's able to pen me. So I've been aggressive, I'm moving up. Here, view range doesn't matter. This tank has very, very poor view range, so I'm moving up to where I can spot my own targets, where I can be aggressive, be a pain in the butt, and there we go, KV-85. When you're shooting lower tier tanks, the alpha damage and the 175mm of pen is great. The reload is good, I'm already reloaded, ready to do more damage, and then I get shot in the side by a Cromwell. I've just blocked a shot from the T-62, or Type 62, but you can see that the Cromwell, because we're at a bad angle, again, I was flattening up this side armor even though it's sloped, he's able to pen my side. So if he'd hit me here, along this strip here, it would have hit my spaced armor, but he doesn't. He shoots above my spaced armor and has no problems penning me. So you've only got about 120mm of armor just above the spaced armor and below the spaced armor here, and when you're at this angle, it's all flat, so it's even less. But we're going to continue. Cromwell B bounces again. You can see how forgiving this armor is. I take a snapshot without being fully aimed because the aim time doesn't allow me to aim fully. Miss the Cromwell B. And now I'm getting hammered from behind by an AMX 51-100, and he has no problems penning the rear of this tank. So this tank is weak. You can see from the front the armor is okay, but from the side and rear the armor is very, very lacking. But we go for a blind shot, hit the AMX 5100 for 372. Cromwell B is back. He's ignoring the IS-6 in front of me. He's trying to, or in front of him, he's trying to hit me. I'm going for blind shots, but again, accuracy on this gun is not good enough for that shot. That was a bad shot by me. And he gets taken out by an FE201, so we've only done 777 damage so far. I'm just looking for more targets, but yeah, as I say, frontally, the armor could be quite good against lower tier tanks. We bounced 2 shots from the Cromwell B from distance at our side. He managed to pen us once. In fact, we bounced 3 shots from the Cromwell B to our side. But we've moved up, A44, completely tunnel visioned. So I fire, put a shot in, falling back. There is RT in this game, I'm aware of RT. But A44 is completely stuck. He's gotten into a very, very bad position. So we're just moving up. You can see when we aim fully, aim, and then we can take him out. So we're up to 1200 damage. That's the first kill of the game. And we're doing quite well. Score is 7-1 again. Type 62. Not going to give me a shot. Borsig up on the ridge I need to be careful of, but I decide, yeah, I'm going to go for this Type 58. Don't have a shot, unfortunately. But once again, being aggressive. We've got tanks holding the 9-0 line. The 9-0 line's kind of deadlocked at the moment, so need to do something to make a breakthrough. We've won on the 1-2 lines. I'm pushing through the middle, looking for shots. This tank is not the best at shooting on the move, but it's Russian, so sometimes you can pull off amazing shots on the move. But now we've broken through. Borsig takes out the MT-25. I'm moving up. Type 62. I know he's firing gold. He could be a danger. Miss a snapshot. He comes back, so I'm slightly angled, moving back and forward, not giving him an easy shot. Almost reloaded. So yeah, once you fully aim, the gun is okay. As I say, sometimes you can have those games where you're fully aimed and still can't hit the target, but look at the reload. Reload allows me just to swing around, take out the RT who's trying to shotgun me. So yeah, he's complaining. He was saying I was so close to getting derped by him, but this reload, a lot of people underestimate the reload. The reload on this gun is fantastic. The aim time not so good, the accuracy not so good. Borsig's moving up. And again, not giving him much to shoot at, but we take him out, staying hull down. So just 3 tanks left on the enemy team, and you're going to see how this tank can struggle sometimes. So enemy IS-6 in the distance, going for his upper glacis now. There we go. I've only got 175mm of penetration, and even though I was shooting down on his upper glacis, which has only got about 180mm, I thought maybe I might be able to pen him, but no. And that time we go for his cheek because he's badly angled, and again, this gun, even against rival IS-6s, 175mm is not enough. But IS-6 gets taken out. I'm looking at the 5100, and then a T-32 pops up on my left. Oh, finally just realized that. So you can see that the speed and mobility of this tank, even though it's not the fastest, it's good enough. It gets you around the battlefield. It's not as if the enemy team, if they go one flank, you can't go the other. And 175mm of penetration enough to go through the side of the turret in the T-62 or T-32. So T-32 is running, and okay, let's swing around. 5100 has his own problems with the heavy tank concept moving in on him. So I figure the type T-32 is expecting me to come around that corner. Very easy game, scores 14-9, so T-32 is the last known tank on the enemy team, or last tank on the enemy team. And what we can do is we can flank him, and as I say, this is not the fastest, not the most maneuverable of tanks, but it's good enough. And we can wrap up the game with kill number 5. So that was only a second-class game in the IS-6, but it pretty much showed everything I wanted to show. You got to see the armor working and not working. You got to see the gun working and not working. And you got to see the speed and maneuverability of the tank. We finished with 1030 XP. Now, that wasn't good enough for a first class. That just shows you how well people can play this tank. But damage was nice. 5 kills, can't complain. And you got to see the accuracy of the gun. We fired 15, only managed to hit 11. So it's not a gun you can take snapshots with. I missed every single snapshot I took. The aim time is just not there. The accuracy is just not there. But when I let the gun aim in fully, we did manage to hit enemy tanks. We hit 11, penetrated 9. So other than 2 bounces on a rival IS-6, we actually hit and penned all the shots that actually we fully aimed. And as I say, the alpha damage and reload is nice. We were able to take out the Type 62 and swing around and take out enemy RT before he was able to derp us, simply because he underestimated our reload. The reload on the gun is very, very good. I received 9 hits, 4 of which penned and did damage because they hit weak armor or armor at a bad angle, but it's very, very forgiving. We managed to bounce 5 shots in that game, so the armor can be very, very troll, even against higher tier tanks when they don't have easy shots or are shooting from distance. We spotted 2, again playing aggressively on the front line, and we managed to do 886 assistance damage, again because we were on the front line. We were spotting enemy tanks for ourselves. You could see the speed and mobility of the tank. Even though at 35 kilometers an hour is not fast for a heavy tank, we're able to accelerate up to 35 kilometers an hour quickly enough, and the tank is fast enough and maneuverable enough to be able to move around the battlefield. So 35 kilometers an hour is not that big a handicap, and it's a good credit earner. So I did my 2k damage, got my 60,000 credits, and then everything above that was a bonus with the spotting, which left me on 71,753 credits. So it's a very good money maker, and it's a very, very forgiving tank. Okay folks, time to sum up. Is the IS-6 worth 11,800 gold? Well, let's get all the bad stuff out of the way first. It's not a quick tank. 35 kilometers an hour top speed is not fast for a tier 8 heavy, but it's fast enough. It will accelerate up to 35 kilometers an hour. You can maneuver around the battlefield, but yeah, it's definitely not the quickest of tanks. The gun is rather disappointing. I mean, it's got very, very good DPM. It's got nice rate of fire. It's got nice alpha damage, but on the other hand, it's got incredibly bad aim time, 3.4 seconds aim time. It's got incredibly bad accuracy, 0.44. You really need to let the gun aim in fully, and even then sometimes you're not going to be able to hit the target. 175mm of penetration means the penetration is not good on the tank either. You're going to struggle when it's not top tier. You're going to struggle when facing enemy heavies, or a lot of enemy heavies of tier 8 and higher. The premium ammo, on the other hand, is okay. The premium ammo is 217mm of penetration, and again 390 damage, so you are going to find yourself maybe firing a lot more premium ammo in this tank than you would like, but you do need the premium ammo. Premium ammo is expensive, and that means if you're not hitting and not penning your targets with premium ammo, the tank maybe isn't as good a money maker as some other tier 8 premiums are. Usually tanks where you have to fire premium, they're not as good a money maker. Now, it is not a bad money maker. It can make money, but it all depends on whether or not you can hit and pen your targets, and whether or not you can do damage at the tank. When you do damage at a tank, it is just fine, and the tank is perfectly capable of doing a lot of damage very, very quickly. But the gun, yeah, to be frankly honest, it's not a very good gun. It can be good at times, but in some situations it can be incredibly bad. And then on top of that, you don't get a lot of ammo. You only get 30 rounds in the tank, and that means, yeah, sometimes if you're having a big game, you can find yourself running out of ammo. So the view range is also a big negative for the tank. It only gets 350 meters of view range, which is quite poor, especially when you consider you're going to be getting it into tier 8 and tier 9 games. You do need to boost it, in my opinion, but I know a lot of people who ignore that. On the other hand, view range may not be as important because the tank is a brawler. You need to play it on the front lines, and therefore the view range isn't quite so important. It's not a fantastic crew trainer because there are so many Russian heavy tanks. A lot of Russian heavy tanks use radio operators. A lot of Russian heavy tanks have extra loaders. It's not the best of the crew trainers for Russian heavy tanks, but it's good enough. It's okay. But yeah, if you're planning to buy this tank to train up a full Russian crew, there are very few premium Russian heavy tanks that will allow you to do that. About the only one is the KV-5. So yeah, as a crew trainer, not the best of tanks either. But on the other hand, there are some pretty good reasons why you might want this tank, and the number one reason is special matchmaking. Wargaming are slowly phasing out tanks that have special matchmaking. They're replacing them over time. There's a rumor that the IS-6 is going to be replaced by the IS-3 autoloader because the IS-6 has special matchmaking. So it might become rarer in the future, but the special matchmaking sort of helps a lot of the areas where this tank is weak, mainly its gun. The gun is going to struggle against some tanks, as I constantly mention throughout the review. It's going to struggle against similar tier higher heavy tanks. It's going to struggle against higher tier heavy tanks. But on the other hand, there are lots and lots and lots of tanks in the game where this gun does not struggle. And when it doesn't struggle and it hits and it pens, it does lots of damage, it earns lots of credits, lots of opportunity for this gun to do damage because of that special matchmaking. So it's not quite as frustrating. It may not be a great gun, but it's not quite as frustrating because of the special matchmaking. So for that reason alone, it is a big positive for the tank. Another reason you might want to get your hands on the IS-6 is because it is probably, in my opinion, the most forgiving tier 8 premium tank. It just forgives mistakes. It's a very good premium tank for someone who's going to be buying their first tier 8 premium because it forgives mistakes. Now, it's not perfect. When tanks get to your side and rear, they are going to hurt you, but on the other hand, sometimes when tanks get to your side and rear, they still struggle to pen this tank. The IS-6 is fantastic against lower tier tanks. The armor is fantastic against similar tier tanks if the similar tier players in those tanks are inexperienced. It's a very forgiving tank. If you make a mistake in an FCM50T, you're going to die. If you make a mistake in a T-34, you're probably going to die. You don't have the DPM or you don't have the armor, and this tank has both. This tank has DPM, so it could shoot its way out of trouble. It also has armor that is incredibly forgiving at distance and at close range, as long as, I say, players don't know what they're doing. That's probably the second biggest reason you might want to get your hands on an IS-6. It's just a very forgiving tank. It forgives a lot of mistakes, and there are very few tier 8 premiums that do that. And finally, it's the cheapest of the tier 8 premium heavy tanks you can buy. It's only 11,800 gold, which makes it a few dollars or a few euros cheaper than any of the other tanks. So if you're playing on a budget, you really want a tier 8 premium heavy tank, then you can go for the IS-6. Now, I could probably recommend going for a medium tank at tier 8 because they could earn credits as well and are much cheaper. But if you've got your mind set on a tier 8 premium heavy, then I think the IS-6 is a very good one to be your first. It'll earn credits and it will train up most of your crew members, but as I say, it's not the best crew trainer. And if there's any doubt in your mind, probably the best advice I would have is grind up and get the IS at tier 7 for the Russians, because the gun on the IS is almost identical to the gun on the IS-6. So if you're playing the IS, you're going to be getting it into tier 8 games, you're going to be getting it into tier 9 games. If you can do well in the IS with that gun, then you're going to do well in the IS-6, because it's the same gun, you're going to be facing similar tanks, but you're going to have the added benefit of much better and much more troll armor. Yeah, I think the IS-6 is worth it, guys. It really is. It's probably the most forgiving tier 8 premium heavy tank, most forgiving to new or inexperienced players. I don't recommend buying a tier 8 premium tank if you are inexperienced, but if you absolutely have to, then I think the IS-6 is a very good choice. I think it's worth it, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.